Hello, I'm Tracie Hall. I am here with Adam Thayer at Sayer, Regan Thayer, and we are together to talk about a little bit of real estate and law.
Thank you for having me, Tracie. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for bringing the whole setup here. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, in the past, we were kind of talking about rent backs, but also in our conversations, we've also discussed a little bit about the Rhode Island contracts and how short they are. As you know, I mastermind with 20 agents all over the country, and whenever I send them one of our contracts, everyone kind of laughs and says, they're so little.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk about the rent backs first? So do you want to maybe let everybody know kind of why they're coming up and stuff like that?
Absolutely. So a rent back is when, well, in most of my cases, when my seller, when my buyer wants to, when my seller wants to stay in the house a little bit longer after the closing. Usually it's been 2 weeks up to a month most recently. And this is what brought up this conversation, because I was telling someone about it and they said, well, I want to know more about that. And I thought of you to ask, why don't you all like to do them?
Because very frequently, as you know, the last couple of years were extremely busy with real estate. So houses were flying off the shelves, millions of offers going in. And so I think in the haste of many sellers to get their property on the market, they weren't even thinking about, where am I going to go?
Right.
Or maybe a buyer needs to move in a little bit early on the flip side of that. And as a result, when I would get these purchase and sales agreements, they would be light on details. So what would end up happening is we'd approach the closing and I'd have to prepare a use and occupancy agreement. And so for anybody watching this who doesn't know what those look like, it's kind of a miniature lease. But very importantly, we're trying to say that it's not a lease. That way, if the occupying party were to overstay, the non-occupying party, the party that actually owns the property at that point in time, wouldn't have to go through a full-blown landlord-tenant eviction against them. And so when we would go to do those, the very first issue I would have is, people were going crazy, summer of 2021, summer of 2020. And, maybe one sentence on that purchase sales agreement that seller gets to stay in the property for a month after the closing, something like that.
Right.
And then I would go to do it with the other attorney and we'd start asking questions. Well, is there going to be a security deposit? What happens if the occupying party, maybe the seller who's staying past closing, what if they overstay? Are they going to pay a per diem penalty to the buyer in that scenario? And so we would get into these arguments, and now we're ready to close, and I got the realtor looking at me, I've got my client looking at me saying, why aren't we ready to close? And it puts me in a very weird spot, because now I've got to, as Bill Parcells very famously said when he coached the Patriots, if you want me to cook the dinner, let me buy the groceries. And so very, very frequently I was getting the purchase and sales agreement without being able to weigh in on something like that. But then I'm having to make a document that references it.
Right.
So that was my initial issue with it. That would come up quite frequently, where the parties couldn't agree on those kind of pretty important terms. And then on the back end, enforcement of these things. So if somebody overstays and we've got to go after them for money, I think it's one thing to have an occupancy agreement for a couple of days, a week or something like that. But once you start talking about a month or two, I would start to think that judges are going to look at these and say, wait a minute, this is really a lease. Okay. And then now we're talking about the normal landlord-tenant laws apply, right, the timeframes to evict people, who is responsible for maintenance of the property. And so there's just almost an infinite number of things that could go wrong with these things. And 99 times out of 100, it might go perfect.
Right.
But we all know that the one time it goes wrong, it's going to be our deal.
Right.
And so we want to get out ahead of those things as much as we can. So if everybody can just leave with two ththings, it would be not just taking the details for granted. I know, right, particularly in our area, it's a very tight-knit community, and you always feel like, you're doing business with friends, but jerks are out there, spoiler alert, and you're going to encounter them. And so you got to prepare for that. And then two, again, don't take it as a given that everything will just work out on those deals. We got to make sure that we're writing those things as tight as we can. And even if we do write them as tight as we can, stuff can still come up.
Right. That's true. 99%, or rather 100% of all mine have always done well, but.
Right? Way to jinx it, Tracie. Good job.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So next deal.
Exactly.
Yeah. Don't send that next one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then let's also talk about our contract, how short it is. Other agents in other states always comment about the language of it. It's not very secure. They don't have these mandatory dates and issues and things. You know, a Florida contract, as you know, isn't it like 20 pages?
Well, so a couple of things there, and those are all great points. Is being in Rhode Island, it's very obviously a smaller state, and we're in New England. We're surrounded by a lot of other smaller states. So, and it's a densely populated area. So a lot of our clients are going to be buying in one state, selling in another. Maybe they're relocating from Connecticut, or they're selling in Rhode Island to then buy in New Hampshire, or a very common scenario with snowbirds going down to Florida. For people who regularly deal in Rhode Island, there are a few things that we just, again, take for granted, in that because we're such a small state, there's one set of contracts that we use. Everybody's kind of familiar with them. But once you start going to these other states, like for example, Massachusetts has a handful, Boston has a form, the Massachusetts Association of Realtors has their forms. Then you start going to places like Connecticut, and Connecticut is just off the walls. Every single county has their own purchase and sales agreement. So there's a huge amount of regional variation. And then in Florida, they've got all different contracts as well too. And so if you're a buyer or a seller, or you're a broker who's dealing with clients in these areas, you need to be at least conversant, or at least have a working knowledge of what these other states are kind of doing. I just did a talk at the Newport County Board of Realtors last Friday about this, because what very frequently happens is, in particular in Rhode Island, one of the quirks here in Rhode Island is the lack of the phrase "time is of the essence."
Right. And
so some states do it by default, some states don't. In Rhode Island, we don't. There's nothing wrong with it. You can use it. It's used in our inspection contingencies. But Massachusetts, for example, uses it on every deal. And so what can happen is, let's say you're supposed to sell your house in the morning in Rhode Island to buy your house in the afternoon in Massachusetts. A very, very common thing. We're 20 minutes from the border here. And your buyer on deal number one, your buyer who's buying your Rhode Island property says, my lender's not ready. I got to delay the closing for a week. Of course, no, bad things never happen in real estate. That would never happen in real life. But now you're under an obligation, a firm deadline obligation, to buy that Massachusetts property that afternoon, but you don't have the funds because you didn't sell your Rhode Island property in the morning. And the Rhode Island buyer is allowed to do a reasonable delay in that closing. So now we've got a situation where, totally outside of your control, you're now in breach of your Massachusetts contract. Excuse me. And so the way that we avoid that is we make the Rhode Island deal times of the essence too.
Okay.
And when you're dealing with folks here, particularly people who only do Rhode Island deals, or maybe the way the licensing used to work, are only licensed in Rhode Island, their heads are going to explode when you suggest that. They're going to say, Adam, this is Rhode Island. What are you talking about? This isn't Massachusetts. This isn't Florida, whatever. But I think if we can have a conversation with those people and explain to them, no, this is why. We're not trying to be jerks. We have a legitimate reason why this has to happen. And I cannot tell you how frequently this comes up, just because I'm sure you can imagine, particularly places like Newport, it's not only a national destination, it's an international destination. So we've got people buying and selling here from all over the place. And as the realtors, or as a buyer or a seller, lots of times those deals are getting signed up before it even gets to a lawyer. So we have to spread the word to the buyers, the sellers, and the brokers that they're working with, that this is something that you can't just go into autopilot on because it's just a form, or we're just going to fill in the blanks.
Okay.
You have to think about it and say, wait a minute, we got to make sure these two dates line up.
Right.
So, and other stuff, even with your comment as to the Rhode Island contract in general, again, people who are familiar with Massachusetts, that, by the time those attorneys start adding the riders, that contract can easily be getting into the high teens and pages, or 20 pages. Whereas Rhode Island is, usually 7 or 8 pages, something like that.
Thank you so much again. I really appreciate your time and all the information about rent backs, and time is of the essence, and the differences in our contracts. And where can people find you? How do we get in touch with you?
I'm over here with my collection of useless books. You can always find me here. My phone number, 401-849-3040. My email address is first initial last name, so ATHAYER @srt-law.com.
And thank you very much.